Between 1847 and 1862, something peculiar happened at Fairhaven Plantation, located 17 miles northwest of Charleston, South Carolina. While the Underground Railroad operated throughout the South, helping thousands escape to freedom, records show that not a single enslaved woman from this particular estate ever attempted to flee. Not one. During the same period, 12 men from the property were documented as runaways in newspaper advertisements and county records. The Charleston Mercury published notices for their capture. Reward money was posted. But the women? They stayed. Every single one of them. What makes this even more disturbing is what auction records reveal. Women sold from Fairhaven commanded prices 2 to 3 times higher than comparable sales elsewhere in South Carolina. Bills of sale describe them with unusual language: superior breeding stock, proven bloodline, guaranteed fertility. Documents held in the Charleston Historical Society archives show systematic notations beside each woman's name. Numbers, dates, detailed physical descriptions that read more like livestock inventories than human records. For 15 years, this pattern continued uninterrupted until a physician from Philadelphia discovered what was hidden beneath the plantation's eastern tobacco barn, a secret that several of Charleston's most prominent families had paid handsomely to keep buried. Before we continue with the story of Fairhaven Plantation, if you're hearing this from anywhere in the United States, we'd love to know. Drop a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. And if dark historical mysteries like this fascinate you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the truth we're about to uncover is something history tried very hard to forget. Now, let's discover what really happened in those fields outside Charleston. The discovery that would eventually expose Fairhaven came not from escaped slaves or abolitionist investigations, but from something far more mundane: a property dispute over inheritance in 1862. Fairhaven Plantation sprawled across 800 acres of prime low-country land, its fields producing Sea Island cotton that fetched premium prices in European markets. The estate had belonged to the Rutledge family since 1791, passing from father to son through 3 generations. By the 1840s, it was under the management of Thomas Rutledge III, a man whose quiet demeanor and modest lifestyle stood in stark contrast to the ostentatious wealth displayed by neighboring planters. He attended church regularly at St. Philip's in Charleston, served on civic committees, and was known for running what locals called a well-ordered operation. The plantation maintained approximately 60 enslaved people, a relatively small number for an estate of its size. What set Fairhaven apart, however, was its demographic composition. In 1850, census records show an unusual ratio: 38 women and girls to only 22 men and boys. Most plantations maintained roughly equal numbers, sometimes favoring male laborers for heavy field work. Fairhaven's numbers inverted this entirely. The property itself consisted of the main house, a modest 2-story structure lacking the grand columns and sweeping verandas of neighboring estates, along with 2 large tobacco barns, a cotton gin house, several storage buildings, and the quarters where enslaved people lived. The Eastern Tobacco Barn, built in 1843, was notably larger than necessary for an estate that primarily grew cotton. Neighbors occasionally remarked on this oddity, but Thomas Rutledge explained it as preparation for diversifying crops should cotton prices fall. The community of enslaved people at Fairhaven lived under conditions that appeared, from external observation, similar to other low-country plantations. They worked the fields during planting and harvest seasons, maintained the grounds, and performed domestic duties. But several details, barely noticeable unless one paid close attention, set Fairhaven apart. First, the women at Fairhaven appeared healthier than those on surrounding estates. Visitors occasionally commented on this. Second, certain women seemed to work lighter duties than expected, remaining closer to the quarters rather than laboring in distant fields. Third, and most peculiar, was the fact that Fairhaven regularly sold young children at auction, usually between ages 2 and 4, yet maintained its population of adult women. Most plantations kept families together when possible, if only to maintain stability and prevent unrest. Thomas Rutledge separated children from mothers with bureaucratic regularity. One person who noticed these patterns was Dr. Samuel Brennan, a physician from Philadelphia who had relocated to Charleston in 1858. Brennan came from a prominent Quaker family with abolitionist sympathies, though he kept these views carefully hidden. His medical practice in Charleston served wealthy clients, and he quickly gained access to elite social circles. This position allowed him to observe details that might otherwise have escaped notice. Brennan first encountered Fairhaven's unusual reputation in late 1859 when he attended an estate sale in Charleston, where several enslaved people were being auctioned. Among them, a young woman approximately 20 years old, sold from Fairhaven Plantation. The auctioneer described her with language that made Brennan uncomfortable. Not just the typical dehumanizing rhetoric common to such sales, but specific terminology suggesting selective breeding. 5 successful births, the auctioneer announced. Superior physical constitution, Fairhaven trained. The bidding reached $1,400, an extraordinary sum. For comparison, prime field hands typically sold for $800 to $1,000. Women, valued primarily for domestic work and childbearing potential, usually commanded lower prices. Yet this woman, sold specifically for her reproductive history, fetched nearly double the standard rate. Brennan watched as a buyer from a Savannah plantation secured the purchase. After the auction, he discreetly inquired about Fairhaven's reputation among other physicians who attended such sales. What he learned disturbed him deeply. Rutledge runs a specialized operation, one doctor explained over brandy. Improves the stock, if you understand my meaning. Keeps detailed records. His women are guaranteed fertile, strong constitution, minimal complications. He's been doing it for years. Another physician added, several prominent families invest in his operation. They place orders for specific characteristics. He delivers results. Brennan pressed for details, but the conversation shifted. He'd learned enough, however, to understand that something systematic was occurring at Fairhaven. Something that operated with the knowledge and financial support of Charleston's elite. Over the following months, Brennan made careful inquiries. He reviewed auction records at the courthouse, noting patterns. Between 1847 and 1860, Fairhaven had sold 47 children at auction, all between ages 2 and 5. During the same period, the plantation sold 19 women, all described with similar language about fertility and constitution. The prices commanded ranged from $1,200 to $2,600, consistently far above market rates. He also discovered something else in the records. Fairhaven rarely purchased enslaved people at auction. The plantation's population maintained itself through births, with occasional sales reducing the numbers. This was unusual. Most plantations supplemented their labor force through regular purchases, especially as children were typically kept rather than sold young. The pattern suggested something Brennan had only read about in abolitionist literature from the North. Systematic breeding operations, treating human beings as livestock to be improved through selective reproduction. While such practices existed throughout the South, they were rarely acknowledged openly and almost never operated with this level of organization and documentation. Brennan's medical training made him aware of the emerging pseudoscientific theories about heredity and human improvement, ideas that would later coalesce into the eugenics movement, but which were already circulating in certain academic and medical circles. He knew that some wealthy Southerners were fascinated by these concepts, seeing them as justification for slavery and as opportunity for profit. But understanding the theoretical possibility was different from confronting its actual implementation. Brennan needed evidence, not just patterns in public records. He needed to see Fairhaven's operation firsthand. The opportunity came in early 1862, after the outbreak of the Civil War had begun disrupting normal plantation operations. Thomas Rutledge III had died in October 1861, leaving the estate to his son, James Rutledge, who was serving as an officer in the Confederate Army. The plantation was being managed temporarily by an overseer named Harold Gaines, who lacked the connections and discretion of the Rutledge family. Brennan learned that Gaines was quietly seeking buyers for some of Fairhaven's enslaved population, trying to generate cash to maintain the estate during James Rutledge's military service. This provided Brennan with the excuse he needed. He would visit Fairhaven posing as a potential buyer, claiming to represent a consortium of Mississippi planters interested in acquiring proven breeding stock to rebuild their own operations. He sent word to Gaines, expressing interest and providing references from Charleston merchants who knew him as a respectable professional. Gaines, eager for sales in the uncertain wartime economy, responded with an invitation to visit Fairhaven and inspect the property's available women. On March 14, 1862, Brennan rode northwest from Charleston along the Ashley River Road, following directions to Fairhaven Plantation. The day was overcast, typical for early spring in the Low Country, with humidity hanging heavy in the air. As he approached the property, he observed the fields, some planted with early cotton, others lying fallow. The main house appeared well-maintained but understated, lacking the grandeur he'd expected for such a profitable operation. Gaines met him at the main house, a rough-mannered man in his 40s who handled the business with surprising frankness. "You're interested in the breeding operation," he said, not as a question but as statement of fact. "I can show you the stock, the records, everything. Mr. Rutledge kept meticulous documentation. You won't find better quality anywhere in the South." They walked across the property toward the Eastern Tobacco Barn. Brennan maintained his role as interested buyer, asking questions about productivity, health management, and pricing. Gaines answered readily, clearly accustomed to such inquiries from wealthy clients. "Mr. Rutledge started the program in 1847, Gaines explained as they walked. He studied agricultural improvements, read about cattle breeding, sheep improvement, realized the same principles could be applied to generate superior slaves. Started with 6 women of prime age and strong constitution, kept careful records of each birth, tracked which combinations produced the best results." The casual way Gaines described this, as if discussing crop rotation or livestock management, made Brennan's stomach turn, but he maintained his composed exterior. They reached the tobacco barn, a large structure with weathered wood siding and a peaked roof. Gaines produced a key and unlocked the main entrance. The barn's interior appeared ordinary at first, the typical layout for tobacco storage, with hanging racks and sorting tables. But Gaines led Brennan toward the back corner, where another door stood, this one with a substantial lock. "The program operates here," Gaines said, unlocking this second door. "Most people never see this section. Mr. Rutledge only showed clients he trusted." Beyond the door, wooden stairs descended into darkness. Gaines lit a lantern and led the way down. Brennan followed, his pulse quickening as they descended below ground level, unusual for low-country construction, where high water tables typically prevented cellars. At the bottom of the stairs, another door opened into an underground space that made Brennan understand with sudden horrifying clarity why no women had ever fled from Fairhaven. The basement extended beneath the entire eastern section of the barn, approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. The space was divided into individual cells, each about 6 feet square, with wooden walls and barred doors. 6 of the 8 cells were occupied. Inside each, a woman sat or lay on a simple wooden bed frame with a thin mattress. The air smelled of dampness, bodies, and confinement. Ventilation came from several small pipes that extended upward through the barn floor. But what struck Brennan most forcefully was not the physical space itself. Prison cells and confinement were not uncommon in the antebellum South. What made this different was the systematic organization, the clinical precision of the operation. Along one wall, a large table held stacks of leather-bound ledgers. Above the table, a chart listed each woman's name, age, and a series of numbers and dates. Medical instruments sat on a side shelf, examination tools, scales, measuring devices. Gaines gestured to the occupied cells. "These are the current rotation," he explained matter-of-factly. "Mr. Rutledge kept between 6 and 8 in the program at any given time. They're brought down when confirmed pregnant, kept here until birth, then returned after recovery. Keeps them healthy, well-fed, protected from field work that might cause complications." Brennan struggled to maintain his composure. "How long do they remain here?" "Depends. Most births are 7 to 9 months apart, accounting for recovery time." Mr. Rutledge tracked everything: diet, exercise, optimal timing. He developed a whole system. Very scientific. Gaines spoke with obvious pride in his employer's methods. One of the women in the cells watched Brennan with hollow eyes. She appeared to be in late pregnancy. Another, younger, sat on her bed with her knees drawn up, staring at the floor. None spoke. The silence was profound and terrible. Gaines moved to the table and opened one of the ledgers. "This is what buyers pay for. Documentation. See here?" He pointed to a page filled with neat handwriting. Complete record for each woman. Name, age, physical measurements, birth dates of children, fathers of record, any health issues, feeding schedules, everything. Mr. Rutledge believed documentation was the key to improvement. Track the results, identify successful patterns, replicate them. Brennan forced himself to look at the ledger. The page showed a woman named Sarah, age 26. Listed below her name were 8 children, each with a birth date, father's name, and notes about physical characteristics. Strong constitution. One entry read, "Minimal complications. Recommended for continued rotation." The children's names included parenthetical notes: "Sold to Hargrove Est, Savannah, 1857," or "Retained for future breeding stock." The clinical language, the systematic record-keeping, the casual categorization of human lives as inventory, it was worse than Brennan had imagined. This was not simply the cruelty common to slavery, but something more deliberate, more organized. Someone had applied rational thought, planning, and documentation to the systematic exploitation of human reproduction. Mr. Rutledge kept records going back to the beginning. Gaines continued, pulling out an earlier ledger. Started with 6 women in 1847. Some worked better than others. He refined the selection process, learned what characteristics produced the most valuable offspring. By the mid-1850s, he had the system perfected. Brennan cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "And the fathers?" Gaines nodded. "Also carefully selected. Mr. Rutledge kept detailed records on the men, too, though they weren't confined like this. He tracked which pairings produced the best results: healthy children, strong constitution, desirable physical characteristics. Sometimes he purchased specific men from other plantations if he identified traits he wanted to introduce. The men knew about this program. Some did, some didn't. Mr. Rutledge managed that carefully. Sometimes he'd arrange things naturally. Other times he'd be more direct. Whatever produced results. Gaines spoke as if discussing stud service for horses. Brennan walked slowly along the cells, his medical training automatically noting details. Inadequate ventilation, minimal exercise space, the psychological impact of prolonged confinement. Several women appeared to be in advanced stages of pregnancy. One seemed younger than the others, possibly 16 or 17. What happens after they give birth? They stay here for 2 weeks recovery, nursing the infant. Then the child goes to the nursery in the quarters, and the mother returns to light field work until the next pregnancy is confirmed. Usually takes 3 to 4 months. Then back here for the duration. And the children? Sold at age 2 to 4, when they're old enough to be weaned, but young enough to be moldable for new owners. Mr. Rutledge found this was optimal. Gets the best prices, maintains the program's reputation. Some buyers place orders years in advance for children from specific bloodlines. The word bloodlines made Brennan's jaw tighten. How many children has this program produced? Gaines consulted one of the ledgers. Let's see, from 1847 to now, that's 15 years, total of 63 live births sold at auction. Current inventory includes 4 infants in the nursery awaiting sale, and these 6 currently in the program. He gestured to the pregnant women in the cells. All healthy, documented lineage, guaranteed breeding stock. Brennan forced himself to ask more questions to maintain his role as interested buyer. What prices do these women command when sold? The highest we've recorded was $1,600, sold to a Georgia plantation in 1859. That was Ruth. She's still here, actually. Gaines pointed to one of the cells. 8 successful births, never a complication. But Mr. Rutledge preferred to keep the most productive ones here rather than sell them. Better return on investment to keep producing than to sell once. And this operation is unique to Fairhaven. Gaines shrugged. Mr. Rutledge developed it independently, but he wasn't the only one with similar ideas. I know of at least 3 other estates in South Carolina running comparable programs, and more in Georgia and Mississippi. There's a whole network of buyers who seek out scientifically bred stock. Mr. Rutledge was just the most systematic about it. The revelation that this wasn't an isolated operation, but part of a broader network, struck Brennan forcefully. This wasn't one man's aberration. This was an organized system with multiple participants, buyers, investors. Who were his primary investors? Gaines hesitated for the first time. That's confidential. Mr. Rutledge dealt with several prominent families who preferred discretion. They provided capital. He provided returns. Standard business arrangement. Brennan didn't press further, not wanting to raise suspicion. He'd seen enough. More than enough. The question now was what he could do with this knowledge. They spent another 30 minutes in the underground cell, with Gaines showing Brennan the feeding schedules, exercise routines, and medical protocols Thomas Rutledge had developed. Everything was documented, systematized, refined through years of practice. Rutledge had even corresponded with agricultural scientists at South Carolina College, seeking advice on breeding theory without revealing the specific application. When they finally climbed back up the stairs into the tobacco barn, the afternoon light seemed impossibly bright. Brennan's eyes needed a moment to adjust. Gaines locked both doors behind them, carefully securing the evidence of what lay beneath. As they walked back toward the main house, Brennan asked about specific women available for purchase, maintaining his cover while his mind raced with questions about how to expose what he'd discovered. Gaines named prices, offered to arrange detailed inspections, and promised documentation for any purchases. "I'll need to consult with my associates," Brennan said. "This is a significant investment. I'll send word within the month." Gaines seemed satisfied with this response. They shook hands at the main house, and Brennan mounted his horse for the ride back to Charleston. As Fairhaven disappeared behind him, he tried to process what he'd witnessed. The clinical precision of it was what disturbed him most. This wasn't crude exploitation driven by immediate impulse. This was rational, calculated, sustained over 15 years with careful documentation and continuous refinement. Thomas Rutledge had approached human breeding the way others approached agricultural improvement, applying scientific principles to maximize returns. And he'd succeeded. The financial records would show substantial profits. The reputation that commanded premium prices. The network of wealthy investors and eager buyers. By the metrics of business success, Rutledge's program worked exactly as intended. That night, in his Charleston residence, Brennan began documenting everything he'd observed. He sketched a diagram of the underground cell, noted the names he'd seen in the ledgers, recorded Gaines's statements, and transcribed as much detail as possible while memory remained fresh. But documentation alone wouldn't stop this. Slavery was legal. Breeding programs, while not widely discussed in polite society, were not illegal. Several agricultural journals had even published articles on systematic approaches to slave breeding, framing it as a state management innovation. What Brennan had witnessed was horrifying, inhumane, morally indefensible, but it violated no Southern laws. He could share this information with abolitionist contacts in the North, But in March 1862, with the Civil War intensifying, such exposés had limited impact. The Union Army was focused on military objectives, not individual plantation operations. Northern newspapers regularly published accounts of slavery's horrors, and this would be one more story in an endless litany. Brennan realized that the only way to truly end Fairhaven's operation was to document it so thoroughly that even after the war, even after slavery ended, this specific horror would be undeniable. Future generations needed to know that such things had existed, had operated with community knowledge, had involved prominent families, had been defended as legitimate business practice. Over the following weeks, Brennan made several more visits to Fairhaven, using his established cover as potential buyer to gain continued access. Gaines, eager for sales in the unstable wartime economy, welcomed these visits. Each time, Brennan gathered more information. Names from the ledgers, details about the network of buyers, specifics about the investors who'd funded the program's expansion. He learned that the system Thomas Rutledge had developed included detailed medical examinations, carefully calculated nutrition plans, scheduled exercise regimens, and systematic record-keeping that tracked every aspect of each woman's reproductive history. Rutledge had corresponded with physicians in Charleston and Columbia, seeking medical advice on optimizing fertility and preventing complications. Some of these physicians had visited Fairhaven, examined the women, and provided recommendations. The network extended further than Brennan initially realized. Several wealthy Charleston families had invested in Fairhaven's program, providing capital in exchange for access to the children produced. A shipping merchant named Crawford had funded the underground cell's construction in 1852. A banker named Hayward had financed the purchase of several specific men whose physical characteristics Rutledge wanted to incorporate. A rice planter named Sinclair had provided medical equipment and supplies. These weren't anonymous, distant financiers. These were men Brennan had met at social gatherings, whose wives attended the same church, whose children played in the same parks. They'd invested in human breeding as casually as they invested in cotton futures or railroad bonds. During one visit in April 1862, Brennan managed to briefly speak with one of the women when Gaines was momentarily distracted. Her name was Sarah, the same one whose ledger entry he'd seen weeks earlier. She was 31 years old and had given birth to 8 children in the program, none of whom she'd been allowed to keep past age 2. "Why don't you run?" Brennan asked quietly, the question that had puzzled him from the beginning. "The men run. Why don't the women?" Sarah looked at him with eyes that held depths of exhaustion and resignation. "Where would we go?" she said simply. "They tell us if we run, our babies die. And they mean it. They've done it. First year of the program, a woman named Rebecca ran. When they brought her back, her baby was gone. Mr. Rutledge gathered all of us, made sure we understood. You run, your child dies. Every woman here has children somewhere, sold to plantations across the South. We don't know where most of them are, but we're told if we cause trouble, if we run, word goes out to those plantations. Our children suffer, so we don't run, we stay, we survive. We hope somehow, someday, we might see our children again." The psychological control was perfect. The physical cells underground were only part of the prison. The real imprisonment was the systematic use of children as hostages, as leverage, as insurance against resistance. The women stayed not because they couldn't imagine escape, but because escape meant abandoning or endangering their children. Before Brennan could respond, Gaines returned, and the moment ended. But Sarah's words stayed with him. We stay, we survive, we hope. By late spring 1862, Brennan had accumulated extensive documentation of Fairhaven's operation. He had diagrams, copied ledger entries, names of investors and buyers, details about the network of similar operations, and first-hand testimony from Sarah. He'd also identified several Charleston physicians who'd provided medical consultation to Rutledge over the years. The question was, what to do with this information? The war was intensifying. Union forces had captured Port Royal in November 1861, establishing a foothold on the South Carolina coast. Charleston would likely face military pressure as the war progressed. Brennan knew that chaos might soon engulf the Low Country, potentially destroying evidence or scattering the people involved. He made a decision. He would compile everything into a detailed report, seal it with notarized statements from several witnesses he'd carefully recruited, and deposit copies with trusted contacts both in Charleston and in Philadelphia. When the war ended, however it ended, this documentation would exist. The perpetrators could be identified. The investors could be named. The operation could be exposed, not as rumor or accusation, but as documented fact. Throughout the summer of 1862, Brennan worked on this documentation while maintaining his medical practice and his cover as interested buyer. He made his final visit to Fairhaven in August, telling Gaines he'd decided not to proceed with purchases due to wartime uncertainty. Gaines seemed disappointed but understanding. Many business arrangements were being abandoned as the war's outcome grew increasingly uncertain. During this final visit, Brennan managed to give Sarah a folded piece of paper with an address in Philadelphia, his family's home, his sister's name. "If you survive this," he told her quietly, "if you ever get north, find this address. Tell them Samuel Brennan sent you. They'll help you." Sarah took the paper, looked at it briefly, then tucked it away somewhere in her clothing. She didn't respond, but her eyes held something that might have been gratitude, or might have been simply acknowledgement that someone had seen her suffering and recorded it. Brennan left Fairhaven for the last time, rode back to Charleston, and completed his documentation. In September 1862, he sealed multiple copies of his report in waxed packets and arranged for them to be stored separately. One with a lawyer in Charleston, one shipped to his family in Philadelphia, one deposited with a Quaker meeting house in Columbia. Then he waited to see what the war would bring. The war came to Charleston slowly, then suddenly. Union forces maintained a naval blockade, gradually strangling the city's economy. Bombardments began in 1863. By 1865, with Sherman's army approaching from the west and Union forces closing in from the coast, Charleston's Confederate defenders abandoned the city. Brennan, who had maintained his medical practice throughout the war years, treating both Confederate soldiers and civilians, stayed in Charleston through its fall. When Union forces occupied the city in February 1865, he immediately sought out military authorities with information about Fairhaven Plantation. The Union Army, dealing with thousands of newly freed people and the massive logistical challenge of occupation, was initially uninterested in investigating what they viewed as historical grievances. Slavery was ending. Justice for past wrongs would have to wait until order was restored. But Brennan persisted. He contacted military physicians, showed them his documentation, explained the medical aspects of Rutledge's program. Finally, in March 1865, he convinced a Union Army captain named Joseph Fuller to accompany him to Fairhaven to see if any evidence remained. They rode northwest from Charleston on a day that felt like spring arriving early, the Low Country beginning its transformation from winter dormancy to new growth. As they approached Fairhaven, Brennan saw immediately that much had changed. The fields lay uncultivated. The main house showed signs of fire damage on one side. The tobacco barns stood empty, doors hanging open. They found Harold Gaines at a small house on the property's edge, now occupied by several formerly enslaved families who had claimed the land. Gaines, no longer an overseer but a man trying to survive in the collapsed economy, told them what had happened. When news came that the war was ending, people started leaving. Gaines said, "The enslaved people just walked away. Some of the women went down to that underground cell and tore it apart. They wanted to destroy everything, the records, the cell itself. I didn't try to stop them. By then, what did it matter? The ledgers?" Brennan asked. "The documentation? Burned. The women burned everything. All Mr. Rutledge's records, years of documentation, all of it. They made a fire right there in the tobacco barn and burned every paper they could find." "What about the women themselves?" Sarah, Ruth, the others. Gaines shrugged. Most left. I heard some went north with Union soldiers. Others scattered to different plantations looking for children who'd been sold. I don't know what happened to most of them. Captain Fuller wanted to see the underground cell. Gaines led them to the Eastern Tobacco Barn, now a burned-out shell. The door to the underground space stood open. They descended the stairs, Brennan for the first time in 3 years, Fuller for the first time ever. The cell was exactly as Brennan remembered, but transformed by destruction. The doors to individual cells had been torn from their hinges. The examination table was overturned. Ashes filled several buckets where papers had been burned. The charts on the walls had been ripped down, leaving only torn fragments. But not everything was destroyed. In the debris, Brennan found a ledger that had partially survived. Pages charred at the edges but still legible. It covered the years 1847-1852, the program's early period. He carefully gathered the damaged book and several other paper fragments that had escaped complete destruction. Captain Fuller stood in the middle of the underground space, looking at the cells, trying to comprehend what had occurred here. "How long did this operate?" he asked quietly. 15 years, Brennan replied. From 1847 to 1862. 63 children sold. Multiple women cycled through the program. All of it documented, systematized, refined over time. And it was legal. Slavery was legal. Breeding programs were legal. Nothing about this violated Southern law at the time. Fuller shook his head slowly. "What kind of men?" "Respected men," Brennan interrupted. "Prominent Charleston families, church members, civic leaders, men who believed they were being innovative, applying scientific principles to estate management. They saw no moral problem with any of it. They searched the rest of the property, but found little additional evidence. The formerly enslaved people who now occupied portions of Fairhaven confirmed that most of the women from the breeding program had left immediately after emancipation. Some had gone north, others had traveled to plantations in Georgia and Alabama, searching for children sold years earlier. One elderly woman, who had worked in the main house, told Brennan that she remembered Sarah. She left in late February, soon as she heard Sherman's army was coming. Said she was going to find her children. She had an address somewhere up north. Piece of paper she'd kept hidden for years. I saw her write down the names of her children before she left. 8 names, their ages, the plantations where they'd been sold. She was going to find every one of them, she said. Did you know where she went first? Georgia, I think. That's where 2 of her babies were sold. Brennan felt a small measure of satisfaction knowing Sarah had kept the address he'd given her, had survived until freedom, and was now actively searching for her children. Whether she would find them, whether they would recognize each other after years of separation, whether any reunion was even possible. These questions remained unanswerable. Captain Fuller filed a report with military authorities documenting Fairhaven's breeding program, including Brennan's 3-year-old testimony and the physical evidence of the underground cell. The report was added to a growing collection of documentation about slavery's specific horrors, part of the vast record-keeping project Union authorities undertook to document the system they'd helped destroy. But there were no prosecutions. James Rutledge, Thomas Rutledge III's son, had died at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. Harold Gaines, as mere overseer, was not considered legally responsible for policies set by his employers. The investors who'd financed the program, Crawford, Hayward, Sinclair, and others, were wealthy Charleston citizens navigating the complexities of Reconstruction, and military authorities decided pursuing them would destabilize an already unstable situation. Brennan pushed for some form of accountability, but Union officials made clear their priority was political reconstruction, not prosecuting individual crimes that had been legal under Southern law. Slavery itself was the crime, one colonel told him. "We've ended slavery. That's the justice available." It wasn't enough. Brennan knew it wasn't enough. But it was all the justice that would be offered. He spent the remainder of 1865 and early 1866 in Charleston, helping with medical care for newly freed people and continuing to document what he'd learned about Fairhaven and similar operations. He interviewed dozens of formerly enslaved people, gathering their testimonies, recording their stories. He learned of at least 4 other breeding programs in South Carolina alone, plus several more in Georgia and Alabama. The network was extensive, and Fairhaven had been only one node in a much larger system. In March 1866, Brennan received a letter at his Charleston address. It had been forwarded from Philadelphia, sent by his sister, who explained that a woman had arrived at their home several months earlier, carrying his address. The woman was Sarah. The letter continued in Sarah's own words. She had learned to read and write with help from Brennan's sister, telling her story of the past year. She had traveled to 3 different plantations in Georgia, successfully locating 2 of her children. One was now 12 years old, the other 14. Neither remembered her. The younger one had been told his mother had died. The older one barely recalled anything before being sold. Sarah had spent weeks with them, trying to rebuild some connection, but ultimately decided not to disrupt the lives they'd built. She left them at their plantations, now working as paid laborers rather than enslaved people, with a promise to visit again. "I found 2 of my 8, Sarah wrote, "and I will keep looking for the others. But I wanted you to know I survived. I wanted you to know that what you documented matters. Someone recorded what happened to us. Someone will remember. That matters more than I can say." The letter concluded with Sarah's plan to continue searching, traveling from plantation to plantation, following any lead about children sold from Fairhaven between 1847 and 1862. Brennan never heard from Sarah again. He didn't know if she found the rest of her children or what became of her. But her letter confirmed something important. Documentation mattered. Recording the truth mattered. Even when justice was impossible, witness remained valuable. In late 1866, Brennan compiled his final report on Fairhaven Plantation, incorporating the additional testimony he'd gathered and the physical evidence that had survived. He prepared multiple copies and arranged for them to be placed in archives in Philadelphia, Boston, and Charleston, where they would remain as historical record of what had occurred. The report included everything. Names of investors, descriptions of the breeding program, diagrams of the underground cell, testimonies from Sarah and other women, financial records showing profits, correspondence between Thomas Rutledge and various physicians, and detailed documentation of how the system operated for 15 years with full knowledge of Charleston's elite. He titled the report simply, "Documentation of Systematic Human Breeding Operations at Fairhaven Plantation, Charleston District, South Carolina, 1847-1862. In his conclusion, Brennan wrote, "What occurred at Fairhaven was not the aberration of one disturbed individual, but the logical extension of a system that treated human beings as property." Thomas Rutledge did not invent human breeding. He simply systematized it, documented it, and refined it according to principles he believed were scientifically sound. His operation succeeded because slavery made it legal, because wealthy investors made it profitable, and because social structures made it invisible to those who preferred not to see. The women imprisoned in Fairhaven's underground cell were not victims of one man's cruelty, but of an entire society's moral failure. Their suffering was not exceptional within slavery's framework. It was exemplary of the logical conclusions that framework permitted. We must remember not because this was uniquely terrible, but because it was terribly common. Fairhaven was one documented example of a practice that occurred at countless plantations across the South. We cannot prosecute the dead or change the past, but we can ensure that what happened is recorded, remembered, and understood. We can insist that the comfortable fiction of benevolent slavery be confronted with the documented reality of places like Fairhaven. And we can honor the women who survived by refusing to let their suffering be forgotten or minimized. They stayed when they wanted to run. They endured because they had no choice. And now, in freedom, They search for children they were never allowed to keep. That is the legacy of places like Fairhaven, not just the suffering inflicted, but the lives still being lived in its shadow. Brennan deposited his final report in January 1867, then returned to Philadelphia to resume medical practice. He continued to correspond with formerly enslaved people from Fairhaven, helping several locate family members and providing medical care when needed. But he never returned to Charleston or to the plantation itself. Fairhaven remained abandoned through the late 1860s. Various families attempted to farm portions of the land during Reconstruction, but none stayed long. By the 1870s, the property had been divided and sold to multiple owners. The main house was demolished in 1874. The tobacco barns collapsed gradually over the following decades. The underground cell beneath the eastern tobacco barn was filled in during the 1880s when a new owner attempted to build on the site. Workers who excavated the area reported finding remnants of the cells, but most of the structure was destroyed or buried. By 1890, no surface evidence remained of what had been hidden there. The families who had invested in Fairhaven's breeding program, Crawford, Hayward, Sinclair, and others, remained prominent in Charleston society through the Reconstruction era and beyond. None ever acknowledged their involvement. When Brennan's report was occasionally referenced in abolitionist literature or historical accounts, these families dismissed it as Northern propaganda, exaggerated or fabricated to justify the war and Reconstruction policies. In 1873, a Charleston newspaper published a letter from James Crawford's son defending his father's reputation and denying any involvement in the activities Brennan had documented. These accusations, the letter stated, are the bitter fabrications of those who seek to justify their invasion of our homeland. No such program existed. My father was a respectable merchant who conducted himself with honor throughout his life. Similar denials came from other families. Without the original ledgers, destroyed by the women who had suffered under the program, and with Thomas Rutledge dead, definitive proof remained elusive. Brennan's documentation was detailed, but skeptics could always dismiss it as the biased account of an abolitionist physician with political motivations. The formerly enslaved people from Fairhaven scattered across the country after emancipation. Most disappeared into the vast population of freed people rebuilding lives after the war. A few, like Sarah, maintained contact with Northern allies, but most simply moved on, trying to construct futures rather than document the past. What Brennan didn't know, what he couldn't have known in those years immediately following the war, was that several of the children sold from Fairhaven carried with them fragments of memory that would resurface decades later. In 1889, a woman named Clara Hayward, living in Atlanta and working as a seamstress, wrote to the Freedmen's Bureau with a peculiar inquiry. She was trying to locate information about her birth, which she believed had occurred at a plantation near Charleston. Her earliest memory, she wrote, was of being separated from her mother at approximately age 3, and of a man examining her teeth and measuring her height before she was placed in a wagon. The Freedmen's Bureau forwarded her letter to several contacts in Charleston, and eventually it reached a church group that had been collecting testimonies from formerly enslaved people. Someone in that group knew of Brennan's documentation. They sent Clara a copy of portions of his report, along with what remained of the fragmentary ledgers he had saved. Clara's response, preserved in church archives, revealed something Brennan had not fully considered. The children from Fairhaven, now adults, were beginning to search for their origins. I always knew something was different about how I was sold, Clara wrote. The plantation where I grew up, the owners would sometimes mention that I came from quality stock, that I'd been purchased specifically for breeding. I never understood what that meant until I read Dr. Brennan's report. Now I understand. I was one of the products of that program. My mother's name was Ruth, according to the records you sent. She gave birth to me in 1856. I have spent my entire life not knowing her, and now I learn she was imprisoned underground, that I was taken from her deliberately as part of a business operation. Clara's letter continued with a request that would occupy the final years of Brennan's life. She wanted to know if anyone had information about what happened to Ruth, whether she had survived the war, whether there was any possibility of finding her. Brennan, now in his 60s and semi-retired, took up Clara's case with the determination of someone who understood this might be his last opportunity to provide some measure of resolution. He wrote to every Freedmen's Bureau office in South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, asking if anyone had records of a woman named Ruth, approximately 50 years old, who had been enslaved at Fairhaven Plantation. He contacted church groups, charitable organizations, and black community leaders who were helping formerly enslaved people locate scattered family members. The search took nearly 2 years. During that time, Brennan received responses from dozens of people, some with information about women named Ruth, none of whom matched the specific details from Fairhaven's fragmentary records. He learned that Ruth was a common name, that thousands of women had been separated from their children, that the chances of finding one specific person in the chaos of post-war migration were vanishingly small. But in March 1891, 3 months before Brennan's death, he received a letter from a minister in Mobile, Alabama, who had heard about the search through a network of black churches. The minister wrote that an elderly woman named Ruth had been living in his congregation for several years. She rarely spoke about her past, but she had once mentioned being held in an underground cell at a plantation near Charleston, and she had given birth to 8 children, all of whom were taken from her. Brennan immediately sent Clara the minister's contact information. He never learned whether Clara and Ruth were reunited. He died in June 1891 before any further correspondence reached him. But church records in Mobile show that in April 1891, a woman named Clara Haywood visited the city and spent 2 weeks there. The minister's diary entry from that period notes, "Clara has found her mother. After 35 years of separation, they recognized each other immediately. Ruth wept for 3 days without stopping. Clara told me her mother kept saying the same thing. They told me if I ran, my babies would die. So I stayed. I stayed for you." This reunion, one of the few documented successes among Fairhaven's separated families, revealed something about the program's long-term impact. Ruth had not been able to read the Underground Railroad signals or respond to opportunities for escape, not because she was physically prevented, but because the psychological control was absolute. She had believed for 15 years that any act of resistance would result in her children's deaths. Even after emancipation, even after learning that slavery had ended, that belief remained embedded in her understanding of the world. Clara's correspondence with the minister, preserved in the church's archives, provides one of the few first-hand accounts of what it meant to be a product of Fairhaven's breeding program. "My mother told me that after I was born, she was allowed to nurse me for 2 weeks. Then I was taken to what they called the nursery, and she saw me only occasionally until I was sold at age 3. She said she tried to memorize everything about me, the shape of my face, a birthmark on my shoulder, the sound of my voice. She was terrified she would forget me. When we met again in Mobile, she looked at my shoulder first thing. The birthmark is still there. She touched it and said, 'I remembered right. I remembered you right.'" The reunion between Clara and Ruth sparked other searches. Word spread through black church networks and community organizations that Fairhaven's children were trying to locate their mothers, and that fragmentary records existed that might help. Between 1891 and 1895, at least 6 more people contacted various organizations claiming to be products of Fairhaven's breeding program, all searching for family members. Some of these searches succeeded. Others ended in disappointment or with the discovery that the person sought had died years earlier. But the searches themselves revealed the program's full scope in ways that Brennan's original documentation could not. The children sold from Fairhaven had been scattered across 7 states. They'd been purchased by plantations from Virginia to Texas. Some had been sold multiple times, moving from owner to owner as property changed hands. Tracking their movements required piecing together fragmentary records from multiple sources: auction houses, plantation ledgers, Freedmen's Bureau documents, church registries. A historian named Margaret Thornton, affiliated with Atlanta University, became interested in documenting these searches in the mid-1890s. She had read Brennan's report and understood that Fairhaven represented something significant, a documented case study of systematic breeding that could illuminate broader patterns. Between 1895 and 1900, Thornton interviewed 12 people who identified as Fairhaven products, along with 3 women who had been imprisoned in the breeding program and survived. Her research, published in 1901 as a modest academic paper titled Systematic Reproduction and Family Separation, a case study of Fairhaven Plantation, provided the first comprehensive analysis of the program's long-term effects. Thornton documented psychological patterns among the survivors: persistent anxiety, difficulty forming attachments, recurring nightmares about separation and confinement. She noted that several of the women who had been in the breeding program never had children after emancipation, despite being of childbearing age when freed. The experience of forced reproduction, of having children systematically taken, appears to have created a permanent aversion to pregnancy, Thornton wrote. Most significantly, Thornton's research revealed the network's extent. Through careful analysis of auction records and correspondence between plantations, she identified at least 11 other estates in South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama that had operated similar programs between 1840 and 1865. Fairhaven had not been unique. It had been part of a coordinated system, with planters sharing information about techniques, comparing results, and even trading enslaved people specifically for breeding purposes. One particularly disturbing discovery in Thornton's research was documentation of what she called breeding exchanges. Several plantations, including Fairhaven, had arranged temporary transfers of enslaved men to introduce specific physical characteristics into their programs. A letter from Thomas Rutledge to a Georgia planter, dated 1857 and preserved in a county archive, discussed such an arrangement. "I am pleased to accept your offer of Jacob for a period of 6 months. His height and build match the specifications we discussed. I anticipate several promising additions to our program from this arrangement. Payment as agreed, $200 for the term, with an additional $50 bonus if results prove satisfactory." The clinical language, the explicit commodification of human reproduction, the casual coordination between planters, all of this confirmed that Fairhaven represented not an aberration, but a business model that multiple operations had adopted. Thornton's paper received little attention when published. Academic interest in the specific mechanisms of slavery was limited in 1901, when national attention was focused on other matters, and when many Southern historians were actively promoting narratives that minimized slavery's brutality. The few reviews her work received dismissed it as exaggerated or as dredging up painful history that was better left buried. But within black communities, particularly in the South, Thornton's research circulated widely. It provided validation for stories that had been passed down, but rarely believed by outside audiences. Families that had known about breeding programs, but had been told such things were myths or exaggerations, now had documented proof that such operations existed and functioned exactly as they remembered. The paper also provided something else: names. Thornton had documented the investors who financed Fairhaven and similar programs: Crawford, Hayward, Sinclair, and several others. These families, still prominent in Charleston and other southern cities, found themselves unexpectedly confronted with their ancestors' involvement in systematic breeding operations. The response was swift and hostile. In 1902, descendants of the families named in Thornton's research pressured Atlanta University to disavow her work. The university, dependent on philanthropic contributions including from Southern donors, issued a statement calling Thornton's research poorly substantiated and suggesting it did not meet academic standards. Thornton herself faced significant professional consequences. She lost her teaching position and struggled to find academic employment afterward. But the documentation existed. Brennan's report existed. The fragmentary ledgers existed. The testimonies from survivors existed. And increasingly, the children who had been products of these programs were speaking publicly about their experiences, refusing to let the history be erased or minimized. One of these voices belonged to Samuel Crawford, ironically sharing a surname with one of Fairhaven's investors, though no relation. Born at Fairhaven in 1859 and sold at age 3 to a Mississippi plantation, Crawford had become a minister and community organizer in Jackson. In 1903, he published a short memoir titled Born for Sale: My Life as a Product of Systematic Breeding. The memoir described his childhood on the Mississippi plantation, where he was told repeatedly that he came from superior stock and was expected to produce children who could be sold at premium prices. "I was not raised to be a person," Crawford wrote. "I was raised to be a product. My value was assessed by my physical characteristics, my health, my potential for reproduction. When I was old enough to understand what had been done to my mother, imprisoned underground, forced to bear children for profit, I felt rage that took years to transform into anything productive. This rage drives my work now. I tell my story because I want people to understand that systematic breeding was not some vague historical abstraction. It happened to real people. It happened to my mother. It happened to me. And the people who designed and profited from these programs were not monsters. They were respectable citizens who saw nothing wrong with what they were doing." Crawford's memoir sold modestly, but reached important audiences. Copies circulated among black churches, educational institutions, and early civil rights organizations. More significantly, it inspired other Fairhaven products to share their stories. Between 1903 and 1910, at least 8 published accounts appeared, some as short newspaper articles, others as sections in larger memoirs, from people identifying as children sold from Fairhaven or similar breeding programs. These accounts shared common themes: the lifelong struggle to understand their origins, the psychological impact of learning. They were products of systematic breeding, the difficulty of locating family members, and the anger at seeing the perpetrators and their descendants suffer no consequences. Several writers noted the bitter irony that the families who had profited from breeding programs remained wealthy and respected, while the victims and their descendants lived with the ongoing trauma. By 1910, enough documentation existed that Fairhaven's breeding program could no longer be dismissed as abolitionist propaganda or historical exaggeration. Multiple independent sources confirmed the same basic facts: an underground cell, systematic breeding over 15 years, detailed record-keeping, involvement of prominent Charleston families, sale of 63 children, and a network of similar operations throughout the South. Yet this documentation prompted no legal action, no official acknowledgement, no institutional response. The families named as investors denied everything or claimed their ancestors had been misled about the program's nature. Southern historical societies ignored the evidence or actively worked to suppress it. And nationally, in the early 1900s, there was little appetite for confronting the specific mechanisms by which slavery had operated. What did exist by 1910 was a growing archive of testimony from survivors like Ruth and Sarah, from products of the program like Clara and Samuel Crawford, from investigators like Brennan and Thornton. This archive documented not just what happened at Fairhaven, but why it happened, how it functioned, who profited from it, and what its long-term effects were on the people who endured it. The archive also documented something else: resistance. The women who destroyed Fairhaven's records in 1865 had not simply wanted to erase evidence, they had wanted to reclaim power over their own stories. By destroying the ledgers that had tracked their bodies, their pregnancies, their children-like inventory, they were asserting that their lives were not data points in someone else's system. And yet, paradoxically, the survival of fragmentary records made possible the later reunions, the searches that brought some families back together. the documentation that validated experiences and made them undeniable. The tension between wanting to destroy all evidence and needing to preserve some evidence for accountability remained unresolved. This tension appears in Ruth's final letter to Clara, written in 1897, 6 years after their reunion. Ruth was living in Mobile, increasingly frail, knowing she would not live much longer. "I am glad Dr. Brennan documented what happened," she wrote. "I am glad those fragments of records survived. Without them you could not have found me. But I also understand why we burned everything we could reach. We wanted those men to lose their precious data, to have their systematic plans destroyed. We wanted to take something from them, the way they took everything from us. I still feel both things. Grateful the evidence exists, grateful we destroyed what we could. Both can be true." Ruth died in 1899 at approximately 70 years old. She had spent 15 years imprisoned in Fairhaven's breeding program, 22 years searching for her children, and 8 years reunited with Clara before her death. Clara arranged for her burial in Mobile, with a headstone that read simply, "Ruth, mother of 8. She stayed because she had no choice." The women who endured Fairhaven's breeding program left no written records of their own. We know their names only from documents created by their oppressors, ledgers, sales records, Brennan's report. Their own voices, their own perspectives, their own understanding of what was done to them, these were never recorded and can never be recovered. What we can know from the documents that survived is that Fairhaven Plantation operated a systematic human breeding program from 1847 to 1862. That this program was financed by prominent Charleston families, that it produced at least 63 children who were sold at auction, and that the women in the program did not run because they were told their children would be killed if they did. We can know that when Union forces occupied Charleston, the women who had been imprisoned in that underground cell destroyed every record they could find. We can know that at least one woman, Sarah, survived to freedom and spent years searching for the 8 children who had been taken from her. And we can know that Samuel Brennan, a physician from Philadelphia, documented what he witnessed because he believed that recording the truth mattered, even when justice was impossible. The underground cell beneath Fairhaven's tobacco barn no longer exists. The plantation itself is gone, its land divided and built over. No marker identifies where the breeding program operated. No memorial honors the women who were imprisoned there. The only evidence that remains is in archives, in Brennan's report, and the fragmentary ledgers he saved from destruction. This is what happened at Fairhaven Plantation between 1847 and 1862. Not rumor, not legend, but documented fact. A systematic operation that treated human reproduction as agricultural production, that separated mothers from children with bureaucratic efficiency, and that operated openly with the financial support of Charleston's elite. The women who survived left no final testaments. They didn't write memoirs or give interviews for posterity. They simply walked away when freedom came and tried to reconstruct the lives that had been systematically destroyed. Some found their children. Many didn't. All carried the burden of what had been done to them, what had been taken from them, what could never be restored. That burden didn't end with emancipation. It extended through generations, through the children who grew up not knowing their mothers, through the mothers who spent decades searching, through families that were never reunited, through all the invisible scars that systematic breeding programs left on individuals, families, and communities. This is what systematic human breeding looked like in practice. This is what it meant when planters discussed improving stock and scientific management. This is the reality behind the euphemisms and abstractions. Real women, imprisoned underground, separated from their children, controlled through threats and manipulation, treated as production units in a profit-generating operation that lasted 15 years and was considered legally and morally acceptable by the society that permitted it. Fairhaven was not unique. It was simply one of the documented examples. How many other plantations operated similar programs? How many women endured similar imprisonment? How many children were separated from their mothers for reasons of profit and systematic breeding? The full extent will never be known, because most operations left no records, or their records were destroyed, or they simply were never investigated and documented the way Brennan documented Fairhaven. What we're left with is this one story, this one plantation, these women whose names we know only from their oppressors' ledgers, and the knowledge that for 15 years, in the low country outside Charleston, something terrible operated with full social acceptance, and when it ended, the women who survived destroyed every record they could find because they wanted no memory of what had been done to them, except for what Samuel Brennan saved, except for what he documented, except for what remains in archives, testimony that someone witnessed, recorded, and preserved. And now you know it too. You know that Fairhaven existed. You know what happened there. You know that no woman ever ran away, and you know why. You know that dozens of children were sold at auction, separated from their mothers, scattered across the South. You know that prominent families invested in this program and profited from it. You know that when the women gained their freedom, they tried to find their children. You know that at least one woman spent years searching, and you know that most of the women who endured this simply disappeared into history. Their full stories never recorded, their experiences known only to themselves. This is the truth that documentation preserves, not justice. There was no justice for Fairhaven's victims, not restoration. What was taken could never be restored. Just documentation, just the record that this happened, just the insistence that it be remembered rather than forgotten. Samuel Brennan believed documentation mattered. Sarah believed someone recording her suffering mattered. And maybe they were right. Maybe knowing the truth, even when we can't change the past, matters more than comfortable ignorance. What do you think of this story? Does knowing this history change how you understand the society that permitted it? Leave your comment below. If you found this account important and want more documented historical investigations like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who values knowing the truth about our past. These stories need to be told, preserved, and remembered. Thank you for listening to this difficult history. See you in the next video.